The scream pierced through the Manhattan night air like a knife, cutting through the usual symphony of honking taxis and distant sirens. Sarah Martinez froze mid-step on the marble lobby floor of the Meridian Tower, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished surface as she spun toward the sound. Her delivery bag, filled with gourmet Thai food that cost more than she made in 3 days, nearly slipped from her shoulder as her eyes locked onto a scene that would change everything she thought she knew about courage, about herself, and about the invisible walls that separate the rich from the poor in America. 20 floors above the bustling streets of the Upper East Side, 8-year-old Emma Blackstone had been leaning against the floor-to-ceiling windows of her father's penthouse, her small palms pressed against the glass as she watched the city lights twinkle below like fallen stars. Her father, billionaire tech mogul Richard Blackstone, was in his home office, absorbed in yet another conference call that would determine the fate of thousands of employees across his empire. He barely noticed when the antique window latch, weakened by decades of New York's harsh weather cycles, finally gave way with a metallic snap that echoed through the luxurious apartment like a gunshot. Emma's terrified shriek filled the night as the massive window panel began to slide open, gravity pulling her small frame toward a drop that would end everything in seconds. Her tiny fingers scrambled desperately against the smooth glass, her designer pajamas catching on the window frame as the unforgiving laws of physics threatened to claim another victim in a city that had seen too many tragedies. But fate had other plans that November evening, plans that involved a 19-year-old college dropout from the Bronx who cleaned office buildings by day and delivered food by night, just trying to scrape together enough money to help her sick mother pay for medication that insurance wouldn't cover. Sarah had been delivering food in Manhattan for 8 months, navigating the complex social hierarchy of doormen who looked through her like she was invisible, wealthy residents who spoke to her in clipped, impatient tones, and building managers who made her wait in service elevators like she carried some contagious disease of poverty. She had learned to keep her head down, complete her deliveries efficiently, and ignore the way her stomach twisted when she saw the casual luxury that surrounded her. Imported marble floors that cost more than her family's annual rent, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than her mother's cancer treatments, and residents who wore watches worth more than most people's cars. But something about Emma's scream was different. It wasn't the sound of a spoiled child throwing a tantrum or demanding attention. It was the raw, primal terror of someone facing death. And every instinct Sarah had inherited from her grandmother, who had raised 4 children in a cramped apartment while working 3 jobs, told her to move. Without thinking, without calculating the risks to her job or her safety or her reputation, Sarah dropped her delivery bag and sprinted toward the emergency stairwell, her legs pumping with an adrenaline-fueled determination that surprised even her. The Meridian Tower's emergency stairs were designed for evacuation, not for a desperate race against time by a delivery girl in worn Converse sneakers and a faded uniform shirt. Sarah's lungs burned as she took the stairs 3 at a time, her breath coming in sharp gasps that echoed off the concrete walls like a drumbeat of desperation. Each floor felt like an eternity, each landing a small victory in a race where seconds could mean the difference between life and death for a child she had never met but somehow felt responsible for saving. By the time Sarah burst through the 20th floor emergency exit, her uniform shirt was soaked with sweat, and her heart was hammering against her ribs like it might explode. But the sight that greeted her in the Blackstone penthouse made her forget about her burning lungs and aching legs entirely. Emma was still there, still alive, but barely. Her small body was halfway out the window, held back only by her desperate grip on the window frame and the designer pajama top that had caught on a sharp piece of metal. Richard Blackstone stood frozen in his office doorway, his face a mask of horror and helplessness as he watched his only child, his entire world, hanging between safety and a 20-story fall onto unforgiving concrete. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his hands trembling as he tried to process what his mind couldn't accept: that in all his billions, with all his power and influence and resources, he was completely powerless to save the most important person in his life. Sarah didn't hesitate. While Emma's father stood paralyzed by fear and shock, she dove forward with the kind of reckless courage that emerges only in moments when overthinking means death. Her calloused hands, scarred from years of manual labor and strengthened by carrying heavy delivery bags up countless flights of stairs, wrapped around Emma's wrists with a grip that surprised them both. The little girl's eyes, wide with terror and bright with tears, locked onto Sarah's face with the desperate trust of someone who had accepted that a stranger might be her only hope of survival. "I've got you," Sarah whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos of her heartbeat. "I've got you, and I'm not letting go." If you're watching this incredible story unfold, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't believe what happens next. The next 30 seconds felt like 30 hours, as Sarah used every ounce of strength in her compact frame to pull Emma back from the edge of oblivion. The little girl's weight, combined with the awkward angle and the smooth surface of the window frame, made the rescue feel like trying to lift a car with her bare hands. Sarah's muscles screamed in protest, her back ached from the unnatural position, and for a terrifying moment she felt Emma's wrist slipping in her sweaty grip. "Please," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of wind rushing through the open window. "Please don't let me fall." Those words ignited something fierce and protective in Sarah's chest, something that had nothing to do with her own safety and everything to do with the sacred responsibility of holding another human being's life in her hands. With a grunt of effort that came from somewhere deeper than physical strength, she planted her feet against the marble floor and pulled with everything she had, ignoring the way her shoulders felt like they might separate from her body, ignoring the way her vision blurred with exhaustion and adrenaline. And then, suddenly, miraculously, Emma was safe. The little girl collapsed into Sarah's arms, both of them tumbling backward onto the Persian rug that probably cost more than Sarah's family had ever owned combined. They lay there for a moment, breathing heavily, Emma's small body shaking with the aftershocks of terror, while Sarah's mind tried to process what had just happened. Richard Blackstone moved like a man waking from a nightmare, crossing the room in quick strides that spoke to years of commanding boardrooms and making split-second decisions worth millions of dollars. But when he knelt beside his daughter and the young woman who had just saved her life, his voice was small and broken, stripped of all the authority and confidence that had made him one of the most powerful men in America. "Emma," he whispered, gathering his daughter into his arms with the desperate tenderness of someone who had just realized how easily everything that mattered could disappear. "Oh, sweetheart, are you okay? Are you hurt?" Emma nodded against her father's chest, her tears soaking into his expensive silk shirt as she clung to him with the fierce grip of a child who had just learned that the world could be a dangerous place, even in the safety of her own home. But even as she sought comfort in her father's embrace, her eyes kept drifting back to Sarah, who was sitting on the floor looking somewhat stunned by her own actions. "Daddy," Emma said softly, her voice still trembling but gaining strength with each word. "She saved me. The delivery lady saved me when I was falling." For the first time since bursting into the penthouse, Sarah felt the full weight of the social divide that separated her world from theirs. She was suddenly aware of her sweaty uniform, her disheveled hair, her worn sneakers against their pristine marble floor. She started to stand, already formulating an apology for the intrusion, already preparing to slip back into invisibility and return to her world of service elevators and dismissive glances. But Richard Blackstone's next words stopped her cold. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of authority and vulnerability that Sarah had never heard from any of the wealthy people she served. "Please, don't go. I don't even know your name." "Sarah," she replied quietly, brushing dust from her uniform shirt with hands that were still trembling slightly from adrenaline. "Sarah Martinez. I was just delivering food to the Hendersons in 15B when I heard the scream." Richard's eyes, the same startling blue as his daughter's, studied Sarah's face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She was used to being looked through, not looked at, and certainly not with the kind of focused attention that billionaires usually reserved for merger documents and stock reports. "You ran up 20 floors, he said slowly, as if trying to process the mathematics of heroism. "You heard a scream, and you ran up 20 flights of stairs to save a child you'd never met." Sarah shrugged, the gesture somehow managing to be both dismissive and dignified. Anyone would have done the same thing. "No," Richard said firmly, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "No, they wouldn't have. And that's what makes what you did so extraordinary." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken recognition, the acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted in that apartment, something that went beyond a simple rescue and touched on deeper questions about worth, about character, about the invisible barriers that separate one human being from another based on nothing more meaningful than the circumstances of their birth. Emma, who had been quietly listening to this exchange while still curled in her father's arms, suddenly pulled away and looked directly at Sarah with the unfiltered honesty that only children possess. "Why are your hands all rough?" she asked, reaching out to touch Sarah's calloused palms with the innocent curiosity of someone who had never had to work with her hands for survival. Sarah looked down at her hands. Hands that bore the evidence of countless hours spent cleaning office buildings, carrying heavy delivery bags, and helping her mother with household tasks that their family couldn't afford to hire someone else to do. Hands that told the story of a life lived in service to others. Hands that had never worn expensive jewelry or been softened by professional manicures. "I work a lot," Sarah said simply, not wanting to burden a child with the complexities of economic inequality and the reality that some people had to work multiple jobs just to keep their families afloat. But Emma's next question revealed a wisdom that surprised both adults in the room. "Do you work a lot because you have to, or because you want to?" Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion she hadn't expected. This 8-year-old girl, who had everything money could buy, had somehow intuited the difference between choice and necessity, between career ambition and survival desperation. "I have to," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mom is sick, and medical bills are expensive, and I dropped out of college to help take care of her." Richard felt something crack inside his chest, not break, but crack open, like an egg revealing new life. He had spent so many years insulated from the reality of how most Americans lived,
surrounded by wealth and privilege and the comfortable assumption that hard work was always rewarded fairly, that dedication and effort automatically led to success and security. But here was a young woman, barely older than some of his newest employees, who was working multiple jobs not to buy luxury items or fund exotic vacations, but simply to keep her mother alive. What would you do if you were in Richard's position right now? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if this story is touching your heart. "What's your mother sick with?" Richard asked gently, his businessman's mind already calculating possibilities, while his father's heart ached for the weight of responsibility this young woman was carrying.
"Cancer," Sarah replied, the word falling between them like a stone into still water. "Breast cancer. She's been fighting it for 2 years, but the treatments are expensive and insurance doesn't cover everything and—" She trailed off, suddenly aware that she was sharing intimate family details with strangers who lived in a world where medical bills probably never kept anyone awake at night. Emma, with the emotional intelligence that sometimes emerges in children who have experienced their own form of loss, reached out and took Sarah's rough hand in her small, soft one. "My mommy died when I was little," Emma said quietly. "Daddy says she's watching over us from heaven, but I still miss her every day. I bet your mommy is really proud of you for taking care of her." The tears that Sarah had been holding back since the moment she heard Emma's scream finally spilled over, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that this child, who lived in unimaginable luxury, understood something essential about love and sacrifice and the bonds between mothers and daughters that transcended economic circumstances. Richard watched this exchange with a growing sense that he was witnessing something important, something that would require him to reassess fundamental assumptions about worth and character and the measures by which one human being judges another. This young woman had risked her own safety to save his daughter, had literally put her life on the line for a stranger, and she was doing it while carrying burdens that would have crushed most people he knew. "Sarah," he said carefully, his voice taking on the tone he usually reserved for the most important business negotiations of his career, "I want to do something for you, to thank you for saving Emma, to help with your mother's medical bills." Sarah's response was immediate and surprising. "No," she said firmly, gently pulling her hand from Emma's grip and taking a small step backward. "Thank you, but no. I didn't save Emma because I wanted payment. I saved her because it was the right thing to do." The rejection hit Richard like a physical blow. Not because it wounded his pride, but because it revealed yet another layer of character in this young woman who seemed determined to challenge every assumption he had ever made about people and their motivations. In his world, everyone had a price. Everyone wanted something. Everyone was calculating advantage and seeking benefit from every interaction. But here was someone who had literally saved his daughter's life and was refusing compensation as if the very suggestion was somehow insulting. "I understand that you didn't do it for payment," Richard said, his voice taking on a note of urgency. "But that doesn't mean I can't be grateful. That doesn't mean I can't want to help someone who helped me." "You don't owe me anything," Sarah insisted, her chin lifting with a pride that Richard recognized because he saw it in the mirror every morning. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Richard replied, his businessman's instincts kicking in as he sensed that the direct approach wasn't going to work with this remarkable young woman. "It's gratitude. It's recognition. It's—" He paused, searching for words that would convey the magnitude of what she had done without triggering her obviously fierce independence. It's what any father would want to do for someone who saved his child's life. Emma, who had been following this exchange with the focused attention of someone much older than her 8 years, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that sometimes emerges from innocence. "Sarah," she said, her voice small but determined, "if your mommy is sick and needs medicine, and my daddy has lots of money for medicine, wouldn't it make your mommy happy if you let him help? Wouldn't that be like sharing?" The logic was so simple, so pure, that it cut through all of Sarah's defensive walls like a sword through silk. This child, who had just experienced the terror of nearly falling to her death, was thinking about Sarah's mother with the kind of empathy that most adults never manage to achieve. Sarah felt her resolve wavering, not because of Richard's business arguments or his obvious wealth, but because of the sincere concern in an 8-year-old's voice. She thought about her mother, lying in their small apartment in the Bronx, trying to hide the pain from the treatments that were supposed to save her life, but were bankrupting their family in the process. Sarah began, then stopped, her voice catching with emotion she couldn't hide. "I can't afford to owe someone like you anything. People like me, we don't get something for nothing from people like you. There's always a catch, always strings attached." Richard felt something twist in his stomach at the casual way Sarah referred to people like you and people like me, as if the accident of birth circumstances had created fundamental differences in their humanity. But he also recognized the wisdom in her wariness. She lived in a world where the wealthy often viewed the working poor as disposable, where kindness from above usually came with expectations and obligations that could trap the recipient in webs of dependency and debt. "What if there were no strings?" he asked quietly. "What if I could help your mother get the treatment she needs, and the only thing I asked in return was the knowledge that I had been able to show gratitude to someone who saved my daughter's life?" Sarah studied his face with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read people quickly and accurately, someone who had survived by understanding the motivations and intentions of others before they could take advantage of her vulnerability. What she saw in Richard Blackstone's eyes wasn't the calculating coldness she had expected, but something warmer and more genuine, the desperate gratitude of a father who had almost lost everything that mattered to him. "You really mean that?" she asked softly. "No expectations, no obligations, no strings?" "No strings," Richard confirmed, and something in his voice made Emma smile for the first time since her near-death experience. But what happened next would surprise everyone in that penthouse apartment, and it had nothing to do with money or medical bills or the obvious solutions that wealth could provide. Because sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but from the simple recognition that one human being has truly seen another, has acknowledged their worth and their dignity and their fundamental equality in ways that transcend economic circumstances. Emma, who had been quietly processing the entire conversation, suddenly stood up and walked over to where Sarah was standing. Without a word, she wrapped her small arms around Sarah's waist and hugged her with the fierce intensity of someone who understood that this person had given her something more precious than all the toys and clothes and luxuries in her beautiful apartment. "Thank you for saving me," Emma whispered against Sarah's uniform shirt. "Thank you for not letting me fall." Sarah felt something break open inside her chest, some protective wall she had built around her heart to survive in a world that often seemed designed to crush people like her. She knelt down so she was at Emma's eye level and gently brushed a tear from the little girl's cheek. "You don't have to thank me," Sarah said softly,
But I'm glad you're safe. I'm glad you're okay." "Will you come visit me sometime?" Emma asked with the hopeful innocence of someone who didn't understand that delivery girls and billionaires' daughters didn't usually become friends. "Will you come have dinner with me and Daddy?" Sarah glanced up at Richard, expecting to see polite discomfort or subtle discouragement. Instead, she saw something that looked like hope. "I would like that," Richard said quietly. "I would like that very much." And in that moment, something shifted in the elegant penthouse apartment high above Manhattan. The invisible barriers that had seemed so solid and permanent began to dissolve, replaced by something more fundamental and more real. The recognition that courage and character and basic human decency had nothing to do with bank accounts or social status or the zip code where someone happened to be born. But the real transformation was just beginning, because what Richard Blackstone decided to do next would not only change Sarah's life forever, but would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, about privilege, and about the responsibility that comes with extraordinary wealth in a country where extraordinary need exists side by side with extraordinary abundance.
3 days later, Sarah received a phone call that made her think someone was playing a cruel joke. The voice on the other end identified herself as Margaret Chen, personal assistant to Richard Blackstone, and she was calling to inform Sarah that Mr. Blackstone had arranged for Sarah's mother to receive treatment at Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, one of the most prestigious cancer treatment facilities in the world, with all expenses covered by a charitable foundation that Mr. Blackstone had established years earlier to help families facing medical crises. "This has to be a mistake," Sarah said, clutching her phone with trembling fingers as she stood in the break room of the office building where she worked her morning cleaning job. "People like me don't get treatment at places like Sloan Kettering." "Miss Martinez," Margaret said gently, her voice carrying the kind of professional warmth that came from delivering life-changing news on behalf of her employer. "Mr. Blackstone was very specific about his instructions. Your mother is to receive the best possible care, with no expense spared, and you are not to worry about any financial obligations whatsoever." Sarah felt the walls of the small break room spinning around her as the magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. She had been working multiple jobs for 2 years, watching her mother's condition slowly deteriorate while they rationed medications and skipped treatments they couldn't afford. And now a stranger was offering to provide care that would have taken Sarah decades to pay for. "Why?" she whispered into the phone. "Why is he doing this?" Margaret's voice softened with something that sounded like personal experience when she replied, "Miss Martinez, I've worked for Mr. Blackstone for 8 years, and I've never seen him more affected by anything than he was by what you did for his daughter. He told me that you saved Emma's life without thinking about reward or recognition, and that the least he could do was help save your mother's life in return." That afternoon, Sarah found herself in the oncology waiting room at Sloan Kettering, surrounded by artwork and amenities that spoke to a level of care and comfort she had never imagined possible in a medical setting. Her mother, Maria Martinez, sat beside her with tears streaming down her face as they waited to meet with Dr. Patricia Williams, one of the country's leading breast cancer specialists. "Mija," Maria said softly, using the Spanish endearment that had followed Sarah through childhood and into adulthood. "I still can't believe this is happening. Are you sure this man doesn't want anything in return?" Sarah thought about her conversation with Richard Blackstone, about Emma's innocent questions and fierce hugs, about the way the little girl had looked at her with trust and gratitude that had nothing to do with economic status or social position. "I think he just wanted to help," Sarah said quietly. I think he wanted to say thank you. When Dr. Williams entered the waiting room, her presence immediately conveyed the kind of confidence and expertise that came from years of fighting cancer and winning more battles than she lost. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and steady hands, and when she looked at Maria Martinez, she saw not a charity case or a social obligation, but a patient who deserved the same level of care and attention as any of the other people whose lives she held in her professional hands. Mrs. Martinez, Dr. Williams said, settling into the chair across from them with the comfortable ease of someone who had learned to deliver both hope and difficult truths with equal compassion. I've reviewed your medical records, and I want you to know that while your cancer is serious, it's absolutely treatable. We have several aggressive treatment options available, and I'm very optimistic about your prognosis. The next hour passed in a blur of medical terminology and treatment plans and hope that Maria Martinez hadn't dared to feel in months. Dr. Williams explained the latest immunotherapy treatments, the surgical options that could remove the remaining tumors, and the comprehensive care plan that would give Maria the best possible chance not just of survival, but of full recovery. When they finally left the hospital that evening, both women were emotionally exhausted, but filled with something that felt like a miracle. For the first time in 2 years, Maria Martinez was going to receive treatment that wasn't limited by their family's financial resources. Treatment that would be guided by what was medically best, rather than what they could afford. "I want to meet him," Maria said as they rode the subway back to the Bronx, her voice stronger than Sarah had heard it in months. "This Mr. Blackstone. I want to meet the man who is giving me a chance to watch my daughter graduate from college, to see her get married, to meet my grandchildren." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of introducing her mother to Richard Blackstone. Their worlds were so different, their experiences so far apart, that she wondered if the genuine gratitude she had seen in his eyes would survive the reality of where she came from, how she lived, and what her family's life looked like when it wasn't illuminated by the dramatic urgency of a life-or-death rescue. But Emma had asked her to come to dinner, and Richard had seemed to genuinely want her to visit. Maybe it was time to find out if the connection she had felt in that penthouse apartment could survive the normal complexities of real life. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing in front of the Meridian Tower again. But this time, she wasn't carrying a delivery bag and wearing her uniform. Instead, she wore her best dress, a simple navy blue outfit she had bought for her high school graduation 3 years earlier, and carried a small bouquet of flowers from the corner market near her apartment. Her mother stood beside her, dressed in her one good suit, clutching a homemade flan that she had insisted on bringing despite Sarah's protests that they didn't need to bring anything to dinner with a billionaire. "It's rude to arrive empty-handed," Maria had said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had raised a daughter with proper manners despite their economic circumstances. Rich or poor, good manners are free. The doorman who greeted them in the lobby was the same one who had looked through Sarah countless times during her delivery runs. But tonight, he treated them with professional courtesy that acknowledged their status as invited guests rather than service personnel. The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt different too. Instead of the service elevator with its utilitarian walls and fluorescent lighting, they rode in the main elevator with its mahogany panels and crystal fixtures. When the elevator doors opened directly into the Blackstone penthouse, Sarah felt a moment of disorientation as she saw the space where Emma had nearly died, now transformed back into the elegant living area it was meant to be. The window that had been broken had been replaced with reinforced glass and multiple safety latches, and what had been the scene of a near tragedy was now simply a beautiful room with a spectacular view of Manhattan's twinkling lights. Richard Blackstone emerged from the kitchen wearing casual slacks and a polo shirt that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. But his smile when he saw them was warm and genuine, free of the awkwardness she had feared might emerge when the dramatic circumstances of their first meeting gave way to normal social interaction. "Sarah," he said, crossing the room with his hand extended in greeting, "I'm so glad you came. And you must be Mrs. Martinez." Maria Martinez had worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families before her illness made physical labor impossible, and she recognized quality when she saw it, not just in the obvious luxury of the apartment, but in the way Richard Blackstone looked her directly in the eyes when he spoke to her, the way he accepted her small gift with gracious appreciation, and the way he seemed genuinely interested in her responses to his polite questions about her treatment at Sloan Kettering. "Mr. Blackstone," Maria said, her voice carrying the dignity that had carried her through years of struggle without breaking her spirit, "I cannot find words to thank you for what you have done for my family. The doctors say I have an excellent chance of full recovery because of the treatment you have made possible." "Please," Richard said, his voice taking on the same emotional undertone that Sarah remembered from the night of Emma's accident, "call me Richard, and the thanks should go to Sarah. She's the one who saved my daughter's life." Emma chose that moment to make her entrance, bounding into the room with the irrepressible energy of an 8-year-old who had completely recovered from her traumatic experience. She was wearing a pretty pink dress and had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this dinner, her hair carefully braided and her face glowing with excitement.
"Sarah!" Emma exclaimed, running straight to Sarah and wrapping her in the kind of enthusiastic hug that only children give without reservation. "I'm so happy you came, and you brought your mommy." The natural warmth in Emma's greeting dissolved any remaining anxiety Sarah had been feeling about the evening. This little girl, who lived surrounded by luxury and privilege, seemed completely unaware of any social barriers that might exist between them. To Emma, Sarah was simply the brave person who had saved her life, and Sarah's mother was simply Sarah's mother, deserving of the same affection and welcome that Emma would show to any important guest. Dinner was served in the Blackstones' formal dining room, but the atmosphere was surprisingly comfortable and intimate. Richard had arranged for a simple meal, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables, rather than the elaborate cuisine Sarah had expected from someone of his wealth. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on Maria's progress with her treatments, Sarah's work and her hopes of eventually returning to college, and Emma's school activities and her evident excitement about having new friends. "Daddy," Emma said during dessert, her spoon poised over a bowl of vanilla ice cream, "can Sarah come to my birthday party next month, and Mrs. Martinez too?" Sarah felt a flutter of panic at the thought of attending a birthday party where the other guests would likely be the children of Manhattan's elite, but Maria's gentle hand on her arm reminded her that Emma's invitation came from genuine affection rather than social obligation. "I would love to come to your birthday party," Sarah said, smiling at Emma's delighted expression. "What kind of party are you having?" "A princess party," Emma announced with the enthusiasm that only 8-year-olds could muster for such occasions, "with real tiaras and everything. Daddy hired someone to come teach us how to be real princesses." Richard caught Sarah's eye across the table and smiled with the slightly embarrassed expression of a father who was willing to endure anything to make his daughter happy. In that moment, Sarah realized that despite all his wealth and power, Richard Blackstone faced the same fundamental challenge as any parent. He wanted to give his daughter a happy childhood while teaching her to be a good person, and he was making it up as he went along, just like everyone else.
After dinner, Emma insisted on giving Sarah and Maria a complete tour of the penthouse, proudly showing off her bedroom with its collection of books and toys. and the playroom that was bigger than the entire apartment Sarah shared with her mother. But what struck Sarah most was how normal Emma seemed, despite her extraordinary circumstances. She was excited about her favorite books, worried about a spelling test at school, and eager to show off the drawing she had made of Sarah rescuing her from the window. "I drew this for you," Emma said, presenting Sarah with a crayon masterpiece that depicted a stick figure with dark hair pulling another stick figure away from a tall building. "It's you saving me. I want you to keep it forever." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at the drawing, not because it was particularly artistic, but because it represented something she had never expected to receive from anyone: recognition, appreciation, and the kind of innocent love that children give when they recognize someone who has truly cared about them. "I will treasure this," said softly, kneeling down to Emma's level. "Thank you for making it for me." As the evening wound down and it came time for Sarah and Maria to return home, Richard walked them to the elevator with something weighing on his mind. Sarah could see it in the way he seemed to be choosing his words carefully, in the way his businessman's confidence gave way to something more tentative and personal. "Sarah," he said finally as they waited for the elevator to arrive, "I've been thinking about what you said that night, about dropping out of college to take care of your mother. Now that her treatment is covered and her prognosis is so positive, have you thought about going back to school?" Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. College felt like a luxury she couldn't afford, even with her mother's medical bills taken care of. There were still living expenses, still the need to work and contribute to their household, still the practical realities of being a working-class family in one of the most expensive cities in America. "I've thought about it," she admitted quietly, "but even without my mom's medical bills, college is expensive, and I still need to work to help support us." Richard nodded thoughtfully, and Sarah could almost see the wheels turning in his businessman's mind as he processed the logistics of her situation. "What if I told you that I know about a scholarship program for students who demonstrate exceptional character and community service?" he said carefully. "A full scholarship that would cover tuition, books, and living expenses, specifically designed for students who have had to interrupt their education due to family circumstances." Sarah stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was suggesting. "You're not talking about charity again, are you?" "No," Richard said firmly. "I'm talking about a competitive scholarship program that recognizes students who have shown extraordinary dedication to helping others. Students like you, who ran up 20 flights of stairs to save someone they didn't even know." The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and as the doors opened, Sarah realized that this conversation was about more than money or education or even gratitude. It was about the possibility that her life could be fundamentally different, that the courage she had shown in one dramatic moment might open doors she had never imagined walking through. "Think about it," Richard said as she and her mother stepped into the elevator. "And Sarah, thank you again for saving Emma. Thank you for showing me that there are still people in this world who do the right thing simply because it's right." As the elevator doors closed and they descended toward the lobby, Maria Martinez looked at her daughter with eyes that held 20 years of love and pride and hope for the future. "Mija," she said softly, using the endearment that had followed Sarah through all the struggles and triumphs of her young life. "I think your life is about to change in ways we never imagined." Sarah nodded, clutching Emma's drawing in her hands and thinking about the scholarship Richard had mentioned, about the possibility of returning to school and pursuing the social work degree she had always dreamed of earning. But more than that, she was thinking about the connection she had felt with Emma and Richard, the sense that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a reminder that kindness and courage could bridge any gap, could overcome any barrier, could transform strangers into something like family.
6 months later, Sarah Martinez walked across the stage at Columbia University School of Social Work to receive her bachelor's degree, summa cum laude. In the audience, her mother sat with tears of joy streaming down her face, completely cancer-free and glowing with health and pride. Beside Maria sat Richard and Emma Blackstone, applauding with the enthusiasm of people who had played a role in making this moment possible. But the real transformation hadn't been in Sarah's circumstances, though those had changed dramatically. The real transformation had been in the recognition that courage comes in many forms, that heroism isn't reserved for people with capes and superpowers, and that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives come from the simplest acts of human decency and compassion. The scholarship Richard had mentioned turned out to be real. The Blackstone Foundation's Heroes Among Us program, which provided full educational support for individuals who had demonstrated exceptional courage in service to others. Sarah had been the program's first recipient, but she wouldn't be the last. Richard had been so moved by her story, so inspired by her character, that he had committed to expanding the program to help dozens of other young people who had shown similar dedication to helping others despite their own challenging circumstances. Emma, now 9 years old and wise beyond her years, had become Sarah's most enthusiastic supporter and closest friend. The little girl who had once known only the insulated world of Manhattan's elite now spent weekends volunteering at community centers in the Bronx, helping Sarah distribute food to families in need and reading stories to children whose parents worked multiple jobs just to make ends meet. Sarah taught me that being a princess isn't about wearing pretty dresses, Emma had announced to her father one evening after a particularly meaningful day of volunteer work. It's about helping people who need help, even when it's hard and even when nobody's watching. Richard had watched his daughter's transformation with a mixture of pride and amazement. The scared, sheltered child who had nearly fallen from their penthouse window had become a confident, compassionate young person who understood that privilege came with responsibility, that wealth meant nothing without purpose, and that the measure of a person's worth had nothing to do with the size of their bank account.
But perhaps the most surprising transformation had been in Richard himself. The businessman who had once measured success purely in terms of profit margins and stock prices had begun to see his wealth as a tool for creating opportunity rather than simply accumulating more resources. The Blackstone Foundation, which had once been a tax-efficient way to make charitable donations, had become his primary focus and greatest source of satisfaction. Sarah's graduation day marked more than just her academic achievement. It marked the end of one chapter in all their lives and the beginning of something entirely new and unexpected. As they celebrated that evening at a small restaurant in Sarah's neighborhood, her choice, not Richard's, the conversation turned to the future and the work they wanted to do together. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, her voice carrying the confidence that came from having survived challenges that would have broken weaker people, "about the foundation, about the scholarship program, about all the young people out there who have the same potential I had, but don't have anyone to believe in them." Richard leaned forward with the focused attention he had once reserved for merger negotiations and IPO discussions. "What are you thinking?" "I want to help you find them," Sarah said simply. "The kids who are working 2 jobs to help their families, the teenagers who are raising their younger siblings because their parents are working around the clock, the young people who have courage and character but no opportunities. I want to help you find them and give them the same chance you gave me." Emma, who had been quietly listening to this conversation with the serious expression of someone much older than her 9 years, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that had characterized her since the night she had nearly fallen from their apartment window. "That sounds like the best job in the world," she said solemnly, "finding heroes and helping them become even more heroic." And that's exactly what they did. Over the next 2 years, Sarah worked with Richard to identify and support dozens of young people who had shown extraordinary courage and character despite facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. There was Marcus, a 17-year-old from Detroit who had started a community garden to provide fresh food for his neighbors in a food desert, while also caring for his disabled grandmother and maintaining a 4.0 GPA. There was Alicia, a 16-year-old from rural Mississippi who had organized disaster relief efforts for 3 consecutive hurricane seasons while working part-time to help her family keep their farm. There was David, an 18-year-old from Los Angeles, who had created a tutoring program for the children of undocumented immigrants, teaching them English and helping them navigate the American school system, while his own parents worked in factories for wages that barely covered rent. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads. Young people who had faced adversity with grace, who had chosen to help others even when they desperately needed help themselves, who had shown the kind of character that couldn't be taught in any classroom, but emerged from the depths of the human spirit when circumstances demanded nothing less than heroism. The Heroes Among Us program grew from a single scholarship to a comprehensive support system that included not just educational funding, but mentorship, internship opportunities, and a network of young leaders who supported and inspired each other through their academic and professional journeys. Sarah became the program's director, using her social work training and her personal experience to identify candidates and provide the kind of guidance that could only come from someone who had walked a similar path. But the program's most important impact wasn't measured in degrees earned or careers launched. It was measured in the ripple effects that spread through communities as these young leaders returned home with new skills, expanded perspectives, and an unshakable belief that they could make a difference in the world. Marcus's community garden in Detroit had grown into an urban farming cooperative that provided jobs for dozens of residents while bringing fresh, affordable food to an entire neighborhood. Alicia's disaster relief work had evolved into a nonprofit organization that coordinated emergency response efforts across the Gulf Coast. David's tutoring program had become a model that was being replicated in cities across the country, helping thousands of immigrant children achieve academic success while maintaining their cultural identity. And Emma Blackstone, now 11 years old and more determined than ever to follow in Sarah's footsteps, had started her own small program at her private school, organizing her classmates to volunteer at homeless shelters, food banks, and community centers throughout Manhattan. The little girl who had once been content with princess parties and pretty dresses had become a fierce advocate for social justice, using her privileged position to amplify the voices of those who had been overlooked or forgotten by society. If this story has touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who needs to be reminded that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort. The real magic of what had begun that night in the penthouse apartment wasn't in the money or the opportunities or even the lives that had been saved and transformed.
The real magic was in the recognition that every person carries within them the potential for heroism, that circumstances don't determine character, and that sometimes the most profound changes in the world begin with one person deciding to do the right thing simply because it's right. 3 years after Sarah's graduation, Richard Blackstone stood before the United Nations General Assembly to deliver a speech about the responsibility of wealth and the power of ordinary citizens to create extraordinary change. In the audience sat Sarah Martinez Blackstone. She had taken Richard's name when they married the previous spring, in a ceremony that brought together their extended families and all the scholarship recipients who had become like siblings to both Sarah and Emma. If this story has touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who needs to be reminded that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort.
The heroes among us aren't wearing capes, Richard said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast assembly hall. They're wearing delivery uniforms and work clothes and school uniforms. They're running up 20 flights of stairs to save children they've never met. They're working multiple jobs to keep their families together. They're choosing compassion over indifference, courage over comfort, service over self-interest every single day. He paused, his eyes finding Sarah in the audience, and for a moment the sophisticated diplomat transformed back into the grateful father he had been that night when a young woman with rough hands and a fierce heart had saved his daughter's life. "We have a choice," he continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction with each word. "We can build walls between ourselves and those whose circumstances are different from our own, or we can recognize that our shared humanity transcends economic status, social position, or any of the artificial barriers that divide us. We can choose to see the delivery person, the janitor, the cashier, the home health aide. We can choose to see them as fellow travelers on this difficult journey of life, deserving of dignity and respect and opportunity." The standing ovation that followed lasted for nearly 5 minutes, but Richard barely noticed. He was thinking about a 19-year-old girl who had dropped out of college to care for her sick mother, who had worked multiple jobs just to survive, who had risked her own safety to save a stranger's child without expecting any reward or recognition. He was thinking about how that single act of courage had changed not just her life and his daughter's life, but had created ripples that were still spreading across the world through the lives of all the young heroes the Foundation was now supporting. After the speech, as they walked through Central Park with Emma skipping ahead of them and their 6-month-old son sleeping peacefully in his stroller, Sarah slipped her hand into Richard's and smiled at the simple miracle of how much their lives had changed. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't heard Emma's scream that night?" she asked, her voice thoughtful as they watched their daughter chase pigeons with the boundless energy of childhood. Richard stopped walking and turned to face his wife, this remarkable woman who had shown him that love could transcend any barrier, that character mattered more than circumstances, and that the most important moments in life often came disguised as ordinary Tuesday nights when nothing special was supposed to happen. "No," he said softly, pulling her close and kissing the top of her head, "because I believe that somehow, some way, we would have found each other. People like you don't stay invisible forever, Sarah. Your light is too bright, your heart is too big, your spirit is too strong. We would have found each other." Emma ran back to join them, her cheeks flushed with excitement and her eyes bright with the joy that comes from living in a world where love and courage and kindness have created something beautiful and lasting. "Daddy, Mommy Sarah," she said, using the name she had chosen for Sarah when she officially became part of their family. "Can we go visit Grandma Maria? I want to show her the new book I'm writing about heroes who don't wear capes." And as they walked toward the subway station, because despite their wealth, Sarah had insisted they stay connected to the city and the people who had shaped her into the person she had become, Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them all together. It had started with a scream in the night, a young woman's instinctive courage, and a father's desperate gratitude. But it had become something much more profound. A reminder that in a world that often seems divided by insurmountable differences, love and compassion and simple human decency can still bridge any gap, can still transform strangers into family, can still create miracles that ripple outward in ways we never could have imagined. The delivery girl who had once climbed 20 flights of stairs to save a stranger's child had become a wife, a mother, a social worker, a program director, and, most importantly, a reminder that heroism comes in all forms, that courage can emerge from the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives begin with nothing more complicated than choosing to do the right thing when nobody is watching and nobody expects anything in return.
This is more than just a story about one night that changed everything. It's a story about the heroes among us, the ordinary people who choose extraordinary courage when circumstances demand nothing less than the very best of human nature. And if you look closely at your own life, if you pay attention to the people around you who are working hard and caring for others and choosing kindness over indifference, you might just discover that you're surrounded by heroes too. They just haven't had their 20 flight of stairs moment yet. But when that moment comes, when life demands courage and compassion and the willingness to risk something precious for someone else's well-being, they'll be ready. Just like Sarah was ready, just like all of us can be ready, if we remember that heroism isn't about superpowers or special abilities. It's about seeing someone in need and deciding to help. It's about running toward danger instead of away from it. It's about believing that every human life has value, regardless of circumstances or social status or any of the artificial barriers we create between ourselves and others. That's the real message of this story, that all of us have the potential to be heroes, that all of us have something to offer, and that the most important moments in our lives often come when we stop thinking about ourselves long enough to truly see and help someone else. The delivery girl who saved the millionaire's daughter discovered that she was capable of more courage than she had ever imagined. But more importantly, she discovered that courage shared creates more courage, that kindness multiplied creates more kindness, and that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is simply one person deciding to care about another person's well-being. So the next time you see someone working hard to make ends meet, someone struggling to care for a sick family member, someone doing their best in circumstances that would challenge anyone, remember Sarah Martinez and her 20-flight climb to heroism. Remember that behind every uniform, every service job, every face that society often overlooks, there's a person with their own story of courage and character and dreams for something better. That's the real message of this story, that all of us have the potential to be heroes, that all of us have something to offer, and that the most important moments in our lives often come when we stop thinking about ourselves long enough to truly see and help someone else. The delivery girl who saved the millionaire's daughter discovered that she was capable of more courage than she had ever imagined. But more importantly, she discovered that courage shared creates more courage, that kindness multiplied creates more kindness, and that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is simply one person deciding to care about another person's well-being. So the next time you see someone working hard to make ends meet, someone struggling to care for a sick family member, someone doing their best in circumstances that would challenge anyone, remember Sarah Martinez and her 20-flight climb to heroism. Remember that behind every uniform, every service job, every face that society often overlooks, there's a person with their own story of courage and character and dreams for something better.
And maybe, just maybe, you'll discover that being a hero is simpler than you thought. It just requires the willingness to see someone else's need as more important than your own comfort, to choose action over indifference, and to believe that one person's courage really can change the world, one rescued child and one transformed life at a time. If this story inspired you to look for the heroes in your own community, or if it reminded you that you have the potential to be someone's hero too, please share it with others and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the extraordinary courage of ordinary people. Because in a world that often focuses on what divides us, we need more reminders of what connects us, our shared humanity, our capacity for compassion, and our unlimited potential to create positive change when we choose love over fear, courage over comfort, and service over self-interest.